Ask the Coach 28 with executive coach and business mentor Nick Sellers. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm very well, thank you, Andrew. I hope you're well too.
Very well. Good start to the year. Nick, I met a client last week and they turned up to the meeting a little bit down and they said they'd had a sleepless night. And the reason being one of the head of their office for a newly acquired office had handed a notice in the evening before completely out of the blue. It turns out the person had been shouldering the workload of two people for some time, but no one realised because everything had been running smoothly. So the client had no idea of the issue. But it did get me thinking how many professionals I speak to who are looking to change jobs simply because they're overworked. But obviously, there's another side to it. I think sometimes individuals don't delegate well or they take on too much without pushing back. But I think we both know this can lead to burnout, stress, and ultimately a poor outcome and the person leaving. So, Nick, this week I wanted to explore what steps both employees and business leaders can take to prevent these situations. How can we identify and address workload issues before they reach the point where either you're going to leave or someone else is going to leave? And for leaders, how do we create an environment where people feel comfortable raising their hand and saying, I'm at capacity or I need help? So, Nick, why do you think so many people take on excessive workloads without voicing concerns?
I think it can be partly maybe because it's just the way the job is. You know, if you think about an accountant, tax year end, self assessment, all of these things, there are deadlines. And I know that many folks that work in finance, who are accountants, will know that they've got these intensely busy periods that come around at various points, maybe once a year for some, maybe two or three times a year for others. I guess also working in finance, you might well have that kind of classic month end stuff. But what you're talking about here, I think, is a bit different. You know, when we're very, very busy and it's going to plan, then we expect to be busy. We know we're going to be busy and we know that it'll pass. But when the workload becomes high and remains high, the question is, do we have the capacity to maintain that? Do we have the stamina and the ability to maintain that high level of demand on us? Because something's got to give, you would think. So it's really the individual themselves needs to be conscious, and being conscious of ourselves and how we're feeling about things is a key part of this. But communication is also, as ever, so very key, that if that workload doesn't appear to be diminishing again, who do we talk to and how do we plan for that conversation? Nobody likes an ambush. So the person that's the owner of the business doesn't want to be ambushed by somebody who is either saying, reduce the workload or I'll quit, or as in the case you've just shared there, is saying, that's it, I'm done, and goes. So I think communication is very key. For those that are in a more senior position who might be at risk of somebody important to them leaving the business, be mindful, be aware, actually do go in and take a look at what it is people are doing. If you find out that somebody's coming in at the crack of dawn and leaving late in the evening, that they're working every weekend, you know that there is potential for something to break.
Yeah. I think in this instance, the person was very good at the job. They'd been carrying the torch well, and it wasn't apparent necessarily without further investigation, which would have happened in due course. I think it's just unfortunate that shortly after the acquisition, this person felt that things had come to a head. Although, potentially, I don't know your thoughts, Nick, maybe the situation, and I suggested this to the client, the situation's still retrievable with the right communication. What's your thoughts on that?
I absolutely think it is. And I think this is where, let's say, accountability comes in. Accountability on the part of the new owners to say, sorry, didn't know, really don't want to lose you. We need to do something about this now. We really don't want you to leave. Unless the person who's resigned has deliberately set out to get a pay rise, it may be that the motivation to stay is not money. It may be that the motivation to stay is that I'm going to come and see you. We're going to sit down together. We're going to figure out what is it that's essential that you do and what is it that can be delegated to somebody else. Because I know you mentioned delegation earlier on in your introduction there.
Yeah, I think, Nick, you'll have seen it in the past, and I've certainly seen it over the years, is diligent individuals want to take responsibility for things, and I think often they'll find it hard to delegate. So, and they'll keep on taking things to the point where the job becomes unmanageable. So what's your advice if someone's of that nature? And it's a good way to be, taking responsibility and being diligent about your job. But if someone's of that nature, how can they avoid continuing to take on responsibility to the point it becomes unmanageable?
We all of us have the same number of hours in the day and the same number of days in the week, we can choose how we spend them. If we choose to spend more than, say, 8 hours a day working, then let that be a choice that we've made and not something that we've been forced into. If we're finding it a struggle to maintain, then those are sure indicators that we've got too much on our plates, especially if it continues. But if somebody is diligent and somebody does want to see the job done right, not everything that they do has to stay with them. It may be that they need to figure out how they can let go of some things. Where I'm going with this is if you've got somebody that's quite senior, maybe the £50 an hour tasks they keep and the £10 an hour tasks they delegate to somebody else in the office. It doesn't mean to say that they can't go back in and check that the job's getting done right, but they don't have to be responsible for doing everything. Now, if there are too many of those £50 an hour things, and I'm plucking £50 an hour out of the air, it's not a valid number, but if there are too many of those important things, those costly things that we've got to do, we've got to look then at how we split that responsibility out and not just delegate, but actually find somebody who's got the skills and the experience to be able to take part of that on.
So Nick, you mentioned, and I completely agree with this, don't ambush your boss with these things, try and plan out the conversation. What is the best way to approach that conversation, Nick, without seen as weak or shirking responsibility, which is something I'd imagine people could be concerned about?
Okay, so maintain your composure and be confident, because what you're about to talk to your line manager or to the owner of the business about is important. They may not appreciate how important it is to them, but your confidence and your demeanor will tell them that it's important to you. If you don't want to reveal when you ask for the meeting what it's about, you can just precursor it. You can precede it with, there's a topic I need to talk to you about. It might be quite a difficult conversation. So that at least then sends out the message that this is serious. Don't just do it on the fly. If the boss walks past your desk, don't just wait until you're at the top of your anger and then just let it all fly, because that's not going to come out right either. So be planned, be structured, approach it in a very balanced way. Write some notes for yourself. What are the reasons why you need to have this conversation, and what is it you want the outcome to be? Now, you may not get the outcome that you want. The outcome might be that you want the workload reducing immediately. It might be that it's not possible to reduce it immediately, but it might be reduced within a week or two, in which case, if you've struggled along for months, another week or two might be manageable. If the workload can't be reduced, but maybe some help can be brought in, that might be another solution. So figure out what the solutions would be. I talked about people being ambushed. I think very often as well, senior people like it when if you bring a problem to them, you also propose a solution. So if you can see what the solution might be, that maybe somebody's hired a few hours a week to help you, or that there's a certain task that you're doing that you didn't used to do, but you've covered it now for a year and you really feel as though it needs to go back to where it should be, then come with that solution. So I remember having a conversation with somebody probably 25 years ago, and she was an accountant and she was great, but she would approach me and say, Nick, we've got a problem. And she would tell me the problem. And I did say to her one day, you're the accountant, I'm not an accountant. When you come to me with the problem, have a think about what the solution might be and tell me what you recommend we do, because that might make it a lot easier on both of us.
Yeah.
And so she did, and after that we worked together really, really well.
Definitely. I had no boss who used to say to everyone, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. But I think it was a bit
Right.
tongue in cheek. I think I know exactly what you're getting at. One thing I've seen just now, and I saw a lot through 2024, is underinvestment. And what I mean by that, Nick, potentially certain functions in the business and most functions in the business, if someone was to leave, they weren't necessarily replaced just due to maybe economic conditions and looking to cut costs, increase profits. I think the danger is at the moment we could see more of that into 2025, where staff members leave, and then instead of hiring someone new to replace them, the workload then goes on to existing team members who become more and more overburdened. So, Nick, and I do see that as a scenario playing out a lot across the market just now. So, what can leaders and more widely organisations do to stay attuned to their team's workloads so that they don't end up in the situation where they've got the difficult conversation where someone's handed in the notice?
A really, really good point. I think for leaders, stay close by. Understand, if you're not based in the same office as them, try and find out what the conditions are. Maybe you can make a visit. Maybe you can ask some questions. What time in the day do they start? Are they working through their lunch? Are they staying late at night? What is it that's going on? And if there has been a redistribution of the responsibilities of a role that's not getting filled, then actually engage with people and find out what could be changed. So it's not just about distributing, because when we distribute things without figuring out what to change, we're assuming that everything's getting done right and it's getting done in the most efficient and effective way. It might not be. So you decide that you can't afford to replace somebody, which is a decision, but then you can also decide, what can we change? Are there areas where we could cut back that would give us capacity to just redistribute? Are there things that we can buy in as we need them rather than having a member of staff look after that? There are lots of different ways that we can approach that topic of change. But you can't just keep piling more and more work onto people without actually giving some hope.
So how can leaders create that environment, or create a forum where staff feel able to come in and approach them? Because I think quite often, two things. I think leaders can be seen as busy, and staff don't want to waste their time. I've heard that from people. And secondly, staff don't want to be seen as making a fuss, or causing an issue. But as a leader, you really need to know these things and get that continual feedback from your staff in order to evaluate it. But how can leaders create that forum where staff feel comfortable having those conversations?
So the best way is to create an environment where firefighting is not the norm. So first of all, if the leader is constantly involved in putting fires out, then there's probably something not right in the environment. That people are either not trained, they're not empowered, whatever it might be. And so the fires keep starting up and then have to be put out. Create an environment where you're working on things that are important but not urgent. And there's a real difference, because those important things that are not urgent, if no attention is paid to them, they will become urgent. So you do have the ability, we all have the ability to tackle things early. And if I use a kind of a practical example, somebody who doesn't look after their health, and health is important to us, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's urgent. It will become urgent the day we have a heart attack, and then it becomes kind of seriously urgent as well as remaining important. So kind of a funny example for you, but it's the same in business, that just because something doesn't appear to be broken doesn't mean to say it's not about to break. And that's what we're talking about. So where people that work in the team are actually starting to make noises, let's find out whether or not there's any substance to that. Because most people come to work not to fail. They don't come to work to fail. They come to actually do their job. If doing their job can be made easier by changes that you can make in the office, in the environment, make the changes. If it's simply, and we do know that people can be lazy, if it's simply laziness, then maybe that person needs more supervision in order to get their outputs up. But a lot of people are just very good at what they do, and what is it they say, a willing horse or something? I can't remember what the analogy would be, but usually where you've got somebody that's very willing, they're the first person to get more put on them,
Yep.
and they're going to be the people that will break and leave.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I agree, Nick. And the original example I'd used after the meeting last week, acquisitions, especially in professional services, are happening fairly frequently at the moment. And I always think naturally there's a risk period after an acquisition where staff are unsettled and may leave. But I also think, as in the example I've given, there's a risk period as well where staff become overburdened because there's an acquisition and the previous role is no longer the same as it was, and they're expected to take on additional workload. So what can leaders do to ensure that if there is an acquisition or a major transition, they don't silently double or triple someone's workload, leading to them becoming overburdened?
Yeah, I think that's also one. It's about being very clear as to what the communication will be. It's not just the additional workload. I think where the one company buys another, a fair degree of uncertainty is introduced
Yeah.
as well. Some of the styles become unfamiliar, so there might be a difference in culture between the two businesses. Somehow a lot of attention needs to be paid to making sure that those differences in culture and atmosphere are understood. And if there are uncertainties, how easily, quickly can they be addressed? They might not be fixed, but at least they can be understood. And therein lies the potential for a solution to be found. But I do think that all leaders in any business, whether there's acquisitions involved or not, it's a good thing for them to create an environment where there can be openness, honesty, because that does lead to things like integrity in the work that you do. High standards are achieved, quality, performance, people are hardworking. And where somebody in a team isn't hardworking, well, maybe there's somebody that needs to be helped to either figure out whether they want to be hardworking or figure out whether they want to stay in the business. So where there's a lack of contribution, that might just be a very conscious thing that the leader has to undertake.
Yeah, I don't remember, Nick, over the past couple of years, and I think it's partly because the job market was very busy, and kind of strange phenomenon of silent quitting kind of raised its head. And it's quite a new term. I think it's when somebody continues to do their job, but to the worst or to the least of their abilities, and with the least effort. It's quite interesting that I suppose the way they would justify it is that, as you'd said, if you're good at your job, you'll get given more work and given more responsibility and put more onto you. You won't necessarily get rewarded for that. Whereas people who go down the silent quitting route, they may well retain their job. However, they'll have an easier life, and it's quite a strange phenomenon. But it's a bad attitude to take. But it is true of many workplaces.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I'd like to think it's a relatively new phenomenon, but I think the reality is that things kind of go round in cycles. And if the workplace kind of allows for that to happen, and where there is a lack of relationship between peers, between hierarchies, levels in the business, where there's an unrealistic or an inappropriate kind of approach to things, then I think what people will do is they won't take the step of leaving the business necessarily, but they'll just step back. They won't push themselves. They won't take on more. They'll avoid raising their heads above the parapet, so to speak. And that's how it'll manifest itself. If a leader finds that they've got somebody on the team who previously was a great contributor, but seems to be lacking enthusiasm now or keeping quiet, find out why. And it shouldn't come as a surprise. So often performance reviews are where employees, members of the team find out how they've done. That's a disaster. There should be regular conversations, monthly, weekly conversations about how things are going, because you don't want somebody to find out at a 6-month review that actually all the effort they've put in the past 6 months was overshadowed by one thing they weren't doing. So leaders and employees need to be, open in how they share stuff. And it's not intended to be personal. It's intended to be helpful. So it has to be delivered in a helpful way, but it also has to be accepted in a helpful way.
Finally, Nick, just keen to get your take and advice on a couple of things. So, if you were my client and you get the phone call at 5 o'clock on a Thursday evening from the head of that office saying they're looking to hand in their notice, what immediate steps would you take personally, Nick?
I think the first thing I would try and say is, please don't do this. This is a surprise to me. I wasn't expecting this. I wasn't aware of the situation. What I would like to do is I would like to come and see you and talk with you and see how we can recover this situation. You're a valued member of the team. You're in a very responsible position, and we would love to see whether we can help you to stay. But if you're absolutely certain, and this is maybe where I need to tread carefully, I would always add, my personality is such that I would always say to somebody, but if you've reached the point where you've decided that there is no hope of staying, I will help you as best I can to take the right steps for you in the future. Because I think it shows that we care. We don't just care about the business, we care about the person themselves.
Absolutely, I agree. That's important. And just on the flip side, Nick, I appreciate you probably wouldn't have taken it to that point. But if you were the person feeling extremely overwhelmed and ready to quit, what would you do to try and salvage the situation?
I think on my side, I would always try to communicate it early enough that I hadn't got to that breaking point, because the person involved may have just decided to quit without a job to go to, or they may have actually been active in the job market because they knew that they weren't going to stay. And in either case, I mean, I guess it's difficult if you're active in the job market, because that kind of signals to your leader that you might be looking for something else. So you don't have to be quite so open as to say, frankly, I'm looking for another job, but you can flag early enough that I'm not happy, I can't continue to do this, and it's serious enough that I think we should talk about it and figure out what can be done. So I would say be open in the right way as early as you can, but don't let yourself get to that point, because when you quit and don't have another job to go to, you're either relying on being very fortunate in finding something else quickly, or you're consigning yourself to more anxiety because it could be months before you do find something. And if you're feeling burned out because of your past job experience and then you quit, you might not come across well in your interviews. You might all the body language might be wrong.
Absolutely, I think that's a great point, Nick. Yeah, don't go looking for a new job from a position of desperation. You want to try and be going in confident, assured, and with a clear head. And I think, yeah, if you're quitting on through burnout, it's not necessarily going to lead to you approaching your job search in the right way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So I think when we do get to breaking point, we're probably not going to be acting too rationally. We're not going to be thorough and thoughtful in how we approach things. So I would say start early.
Absolutely. Great advice as always, Nick, and thanks a lot for your insight. And hopefully you'll join us again next week.
Yep, absolutely, Andrew. Thanks very much for inviting me on, and it's a great topic you've raised. We don't want people to burn out. I don't think it's ever good.
No, and it's increasingly, I think it'll be increasingly common in 2025. Like I say, I think there's a real underinvestment in a lot of areas, and unfortunately, that's then overburdening existing staff. And I think there'll be more of these conversations happening. So it's certainly something for, I think, business leaders, Nick, to stay abreast of early and to keep an eye
Yeah.
on.
Actually, I hope you don't mind me just kind of raising this, but when a company buys another company, probably a part of their plan ought to be to deal with how the staff are going to cope. Not so much in the company that's doing the acquisition, but in the company that's being acquired. How are they going to cope with the change and what help can be made available? Because you want to plan for it rather than stumble into it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we could have a whole conversation on this, Nick, but one tactic that's been used by a few companies recently, and I disagree with, is golden handcuffs. For example, when the company's acquired, are incentivised to stay for 6 months or a year thereafter the acquisition financially, so they'll receive a lump sum at 6 months, at a year if they see out that period. Now, I understand. I mean, I think there's probably in the terms of the buyout, there'll be something around retaining certainly revenue and staff will be needed to deliver that revenue, but I would fear that 6 months or 12-month period you'd have an exodus of staff, and
Yeah.
I suppose whether they plan for that or not is one thing or not. But I agree, it's an important thing that should be considered. Definitely,
Yeah. Yeah. Like you say, a whole nother conversation.
absolutely. Thanks again, Nick. We'll catch up next week.
Thanks very much, Andrew. See you.
Cheers.